This is going to be quite a different style of video. It's going to be a little bit less pubby actually, and a little bit more about London history. Harrow and Wealdstone. Have you ever wondered about this part of London, where the name comes from? This side of the railway track leads to Harrow. It likely derives from the Old English, which I'm going to mispronounce, Hare, which means a heathen temple. This other exit from the station leads to Weald Stone, and that is an area that actually takes its name from a lump of rock. The great thing is that lump of rock still exists, and we can go see it. Blink and you'll miss it. There is the Weald Stone, after which this area takes its name. Today, it lies recumbent, it's lying flat along one side, but possibly this was originally a standing stone. It's a sarsen stone. Famous monuments like Stonehenge, at least some of the stones at Stonehenge are sarsen, and the stone circles at Avebury, both of those constructed from this same type of sandstone. To try and give you a sense of its setting, it sits today completely unadorned by plaques or signage to tell you what it is, just by the side of a curb, next to this busy roundabout, in front of what is today an Indian restaurant, sadly currently closed for refurbishment, called Bombay Central. But I don't know if you can see, poking out above the name there, the sign, it was originally a pub called the Red Lion. Just notice there is a plaque over there on the wall of the pub by the entrance. I'll zoom in a bit so you can see that. It seems to have sprang into existence, that phrase, Weald Stone, in the 1750s. The earliest written reference to Weald Stone comes from John Rock's map of Middlesex of 1754. A little later in that decade, I also found some adverts for property. I think the word they use is messwich. I believe it's pronounced a bit like sandwich, referring to this area as Wealdstone. Again, both the plaque behind me and a letter in the Harrow Observer dated 1949 mention what are believed to be some of the earliest mentions in writing of the stone. It wasn't referred to as the Weald Stone at that time. In the 23rd year of Henry VII, Richard Buckbird ought to cleanse his ditch, lying between Le Weald and Le Stone, 4 perches in length, and he was immersed, I think that's an old-fashioned word for fined, 8 pence. Later in the 14th year of Henry VIII, it is ordered that John Smith shall cleanse his ditch. There's a lot of ditch cleansing going on in the 16th century at the stone in Harrow Lane before the Feast of Pentecost. The earliest mentions written down that I could find of the Red Lion pub here come from 1804. So looking at that 1750s John Rock map, that could just about be referring to this location. In 1838, it seems the pub was rebuilt. Later references suggest that at that time the Weald Stone was built into the foundations of the pub, and it remained there for about 100 years. Here it is in the 1930s Ordnance Survey map, and it's around this decade, possibly in 1934, that the pub was once again rebuilt. It looks like the footprint of it was somewhat different. It was possibly set a little bit further back from the road. It seems that the stone may have been moved at that time to the current location that we see it in today, set in the curb here, a little bit in front of the pub, between it and the roundabout. So that 1934 rebuild of the pub is the building that we still see today. It's very much in that classic neo-Georgian style that we often see for pubs in that interwar period. A later newspaper clipping shows before and after pictures. I think the earlier one prior to that 1930s rebuild was a sketch. By the time of the 1960s Ordnance Survey map, we also see the Weald Stone marked in those oldie-worldy letters we may be familiar with from more modern Ordnance Survey maps. And finally, some more modern articles, one from the 1980s talking about the time at which this was listed. There was also a nostalgic-looking newspaper ad of 1996. At which time the pub was briefly renamed to the Weald Stone Inn rather than the Red Lion, and they feature a picture of the stone in that advert. It's hard to know what the ancient history of this stone was. We only have records going back to the early 1500s that may attest to this stone. General theories about its use are that it was possibly some sort of parish boundary marker or some other kind of territorial boundary marker. It's interesting that there are a few sarsen stones dotted around this wider area, and hopefully we can see a couple more at the next location. So there we have it then, the Weald Stone. I think it's strangely beautiful. Here it is, completely forgotten about in a corner of London's urban sprawl. People walk past it probably without any idea that this is the lump of rock that gave its name to this area. I've walked up the hill to the Hare, right in the middle of Harrow Weald Common, because I'd read that there are actually some sarsen stones out the front of this pub as well. And I assume what that was referring to, this little cluster around the base of the pub sign here. One looks like it could have been a small standing stone, the other two perhaps more worked blocks. And that does possibly feed into this idea that this, along with the Weald Stone down at the bottom of the hill, may have been some sort of route markers, some way markers of an old track, an old route. I have a feeling that the Hare in its current guise has gone very gastro, but I'm a bit thirsty now, so shall I perhaps pop in and see if I can get a pint? Cheers from the Hare. Like I said, I think it's gone very gastro on the inside. It's a bit more like a restaurant in effect. On the sign there it says pub, brasserie, garden. You sort of always know you're in trouble when a place actually has the word pub on the sign. It's like, if it's a pub, you already know that. Anyway, they did have a couple of, I think, reasonable looking ales on the hand pumps. Timothy Taylor's I went for, and there was also Doom Bar, which I know quite a lot of you are really not a fan of based on the comments. I don't mind it, but anyway. I did a tiny bit of research about this pub. It is a listed building. Historic England cites it as being an early 19th century building. The earliest newspaper record I could find for it is from 1860. And according to the pub's history website, it appears that throughout much of the 19th century, it probably was in the ownership of the Foskett family. You can see it marked on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map here with a PH. I have, of course, chosen the seat at the front of the pub, nearest to the little cluster of sarsen stones there just behind me. Like I say, they're very much small, rather diminutive, but I think that pointy one particularly I'm rather fond of, actually. I doubt many people pay any attention to them whatsoever. It's certainly not the sort of place where one might find a ploughman's lunch. That is an Isle of Wight heritage tomato salad. To make that a bit more substantial, I have gone for some chips on the side. I don't think you need to see me eating, do you? At the risk of being accused of having sold out all of my traditional pub credentials, I actually quite enjoyed the food there, so what can you do? Obviously not in its current guise, a sort of traditional pubby pub. But as I say, any port in a storm. This is the Case is Altered. It's not far from the Hare. And this pub, it appears permanently closed about 2 years ago. I think it was March 2022. I think the issue that caused it to close was relating to the car parking. The car park was in fact ran by the local council, and the local council started closing the car park earlier and earlier. You could see the opening hours on the sign over there. At least part of the year it closes at 4 p.m. Can't really run a pub if the only available parking closes at 4 p.m. Quite sad really for a pub that has likely been here since at least some point in the 19th century, and the building may well date back to about 1800 according to the What Pub website. It's an interesting pub name, and you see these a lot all over the country, and particularly in this area in Harrow. The Case is Altered. There's a couple of theories where this may derive from. The phrase "the case is altered" probably goes back to Ben Jonson's play, was that early 16th century. Here it's believed it may actually be a corruption of Casa Alta, Spanish for high house, a house up on a hill, and it may relate to the Peninsular War in the early 19th century. And there is a theory that soldiers returning from the Peninsular War to this area, they had taken refuge at some point during that battle in a house high up on the hill. And of course it's fitting here because we are on top of Harrow Weald Common, which is I think something like the 7th highest point in Greater London. It comes in at about 145 metres. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for it was 1875, and it seems at that time it was a beer house, and possibly a bit of a rough one based on the content of the article. Lots of cars going past. This is a terrible place to film again. I saw a mention from 1889, at which time the landlord was applying for a full spirit licence, which would have converted it from a beer house into a public house. I suspect that initial attempt was unsuccessful because on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map of the area, it doesn't appear to be marked with a PH. We've seen this several times before, whereas the Hare at the end of the road is marked. So I assume at that time it still had status as a beer-only house. However, you can see it on the mid-1900s Ordnance Survey map, and at that time it is clearly marked. There's also a nostalgic advert I found in a newspaper from 1994 for the pub. That includes a photo of the pub, some nice artwork around the outside of that advert, and also a voucher offering £3 off a meal for two. Alas, that expired in August 1994. There is a rather nice scenic viewpoint here, very close to the Case is Altered pub. I'm not sure if I can pick out any particular landmarks though. I guess we're seeing a lot of Harrow in the foreground. There's another bench over there. Perhaps that suggests there's a different view in that direction. Possibly slightly a better view over this side from this viewing area. I had a brief glimpse earlier of possibly Canary Wharf. Can't see now. Can't see the wood for the trees. Can't see the wharf for the trees. Anyway, you get the idea. Nice view. I know this is going to seem like a very odd choice, but for my next pub, it is listed on the What Pub website. It's a place that serves beer. I'm going to have a look at the Dyke Hotel. Rather impressive, isn't it? It is a building of 1872, designed by Norman Shaw, very famous architect, and built for Sir William Gilbert. Yes, he of Gilbert and Sullivan. I am the very model of a modern Major General. Cheers from Dyke Hotel. Once again, this is clearly very off-piste for a video that is nominally about pubs. I think the whole video has gone a little bit off-piste today, but this just seemed too good an opportunity to pass by. It does have a bar that, although it's only keg taps, there are no hand pumps currently, did at least have some Guinness on tap poured by an Irishman, and it's in very good shape. I think they offered, as the What Pub site said, a very warm welcome to people who are not actually residing at the hotel and just want to come and enjoy the grounds and have a drink. And what a spectacular building. The room that is now used as a sort of larger dining room and possibly a function room for things like weddings has this magnificent fireplace chimney piece from that date, also from the 1870s, designed by Ernest George. It's an incredibly sort of exuberant, theatrical piece, which I suppose is fitting for the home of Sir William Gilbert. Apparently did some of his writing there. It was used as his drawing room in his time when he was living here. Very, very ornate piece of carving there with, I suppose, classical bacchanalian scenes, a pair of what I might have at first considered to be Atlantes, the two supporting figures either side of the main fireplace, possibly more something like Bacchus or something of that ilk, fawns or some such. It is also, I suppose, an early example of mock Tudor, dating as it does to the 1870s. I'm used to seeing mock Tudor in pub architecture as a largely interwar theme, something of the 1920s and 1930s, but here we are seeing it from almost mid-Victorian period. It clearly had a sort of lingering appeal, this architectural style that reminisces about merry old England. Well, I think that's going to be it for today's video. It has been a funny sort of a video, hasn't it? Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.